Hi, I'm Dave Hitchcock, and today I'm giving a paper to the Institute of Historical Research Long 18th Century Seminar. Very pleased to be able to do so on the subject of my next book project, my current book project. Um, Empire's Engine, History's Millstone is kind of how I'm phrasing it here today, and sort of keen to share with you some of the first fruits, I suppose, of my current research. So I'd like to begin with an individual who I met relatively recently in the archives, Francis Daniel Pistorius. Pistorius was a German nonconformist lawyer, a poet, an abolitionist, quite a precocious one, and one of the founders of Germantown in Pennsylvania, colonial Pennsylvania. And he features in early American history, principally and importantly for his role in the creation of a 1688 Quaker petition against slavery, which was drafted by him and signed by some other prominent local Quakers. But I'm interested in him for another reason. He left early modernists and colonial historians another gift, which is his commonplace book, which he called his Beehive, and which has been digitized by the University of Pennsylvania. And that's what we're looking at on this slide. I think his Beehive, just like many famous commonplace books, effectively has something for everyone. And I got captivated by it about a year ago in the summer. Why was I looking at it? Well, I'm currently working on a project examining the ends of poverty as a kind of cultural, political, fictive, and social formation between 1600 and 1800. And I learned in a relatively casual aside in a 1930s book on early American economic thought that somewhere in this beehive, Pistorius had drawn a, quote, strange wheel and written an accompanying poem which described his view of poverty and the sort of cyclical nature of the world. And he called it, quote, the revolution or changeable course and recourse of this present world, prefigured in a wheel of 7 spokes, called the omnium rerum vicissitude. I'm just calling it Poverty's Wheel because it seems much simpler. And this is a bit of the poem that goes with it. War begets poverty, poverty peace. Then people will traffic, and riches increase. Riches produceth pride. Pride is war's ground. War begets poverty, and so we go round. And for me, this drawing and the accompanying poem are incredible evidence of how Pistorius viewed the social conditions and inequalities around him. We have a holistic, socially grounded understanding of poverty as at the root of a cycle of immiseration produced by human action and emotion and framed as a universal human experience, but not described thereafter as either immutable or as divinely mandated, so far as I can tell. I don't want to overread this source, but it also strikes me as a sort of state of the world which Pistorius regrets, best expressed for me here in that sighing finality of So We Go Round. And as alluring as it is to linger on Pistorius and his wheel, what I want to talk to you all about today isn't really about him. And I do need to caveat my paper as my thinking is still in its early stages. So I will be sort of longer on sources today and perhaps shorter on finished, accomplished arguments than I might like. And I'll be very grateful for any comments and feedback in the discussion that we get to. So the book project I'm speaking about today is tentatively titled The Ends of Poverty, The Origins of English Welfare Colonialism between 1600 and 1800. And it owes an enormous amount to, in my view, a very impressive set of connected historiographies which stretch back at least 120 years, covering welfare, colonialism, social policy, political economy, the Enlightenment, environmental history, and utopianism, just for starters. And almost without fail, my reading so far in these subfields has been so engaging that I'm actually kind of behind on writing things because I'm sort of so busy feeling like I have to play catch up. And for reasons of brevity here, I want to single out two books in particular that are really strongly informing this paper, and I think will very strongly inform the book project as a whole. And that would be Sarah Lloyd's 2009 Charity and Poverty in England, Wild and Visionary Schemes, and Koji Yamamoto's more recent Taming Capitalism Before Its Triumph from 2018. Lloyd's book looks at, quote, schemes never fully implemented, imagined prospects too complex or controversial to realize, beliefs and details made quaint by the passage of time. I think here showing Ernst Bloch's utopian imagination at work in the 18th century. And she argued that, quote, critics of visionary plans recognized what historians have subsequently missed, the pleasures and excitement of poor relief, the attraction of proposals which appealed to economic logic and political expediency, but which went beyond them, and the intermingling of religious feelings with mundane objectives. Where 18th century women and men combined systematic argument with compelling imaginative commitments, 21st century policymakers and publics follow, end quote. I think many of the men and women in her study could reasonably be described, and I would describe them as practical utopians. Men like Lawrence Braddon or Jonas Hannaway, who founded the Marine Society, and who was also instrumental in the Foundling Hospital in mid-century. Women such as Hannah More. And, you know, regarding the increasing fashion for this sort of arithmetical thinking about poverty and social policy, again, Lloyd very insightfully writes, the problem of poverty was to be solved arithmetically. Calculation unleashed dreams in which religious duty combined with material productivity to make the poor the engine of their own improvement. Their lives would be subsumed within the multiple meanings of profit as means, end, and emblem. And when I combine this with Yamamoto's more recent fusion of intellectual, social, and cultural history in his exploration of projecting and the project, I become sort of particularly sort of taken with how the two books speak to each other. Yamamoto's definition of a project in Taming Capitalism is actually very, very useful, and I think worthy of a quote here. He writes, the project was a promise of alchemy-like transformation, turning untapped resources, such as human ingenuity, dormant legislation, or idle labor, into wealth, a process fueled by another transmutation of private desires into public benefits. In both cases, Lloyd and Yamamoto comment on the imperial dimensions of their subjects or the colonial dimensions of their subjects, but I do think there is room to go farther still here, and I certainly won't be alone in doing this. In work forthcoming very soon, a colleague of mine, not here at Christchurch, but that I've been working with for many years on an edited volume, Julian McClure, has started to make these connections quite explicit in some of her forthcoming work. She's got a chapter coming out in this volume in 2021 on poverty and empire. And in that chapter, she writes, quote, poverty has always been essential to the foundation of empires, and the lives of the poor have always been imperial cement, her phrase, making empires possible through their dispossession and the exploitation of their labor. The poor also receive donations and gifts, known in the Christian context as charity, from rulers in an exchange that is not only economic, giving the poor access to resources, but political, validating the power asymmetries between the giver and the receiver, end quote. And I think this fundamental relation between poverty and empire goes to the heart of my going concern. So I hope to make the argument here and in the project as a whole that empire was both viewed and pursued as a utopian project in Yamamoto's sense of the term. That is, as a transformative activity, a project designed in no small part to end poverty. I think the key to understanding British colonialism in this way is to remember who it was putatively for. To say that British colonialism was and is utopian is necessarily also to say and to remember that all utopias hitherto have constructed themselves as exclusive, only certain people get to live there, and as imperial. They colonize, they transmute unproductive people into productive people using various strategies, they dominate, and they enslave. The only category of utopian thinking that has strictly avoided such strategies, it might be sort of the lands of Cockaigne, Arcadia style, sort of rural, agrarian utopian settings. And in these settings, scarcity has been vanquished by entirely different means, and work is unnecessary anyway, generally speaking. Everyone else in this conceptual landscape, or everywhere else, I should say, someone has had to pay the price for perfection. Now, traditionally, historians locate the gestation of universal proposals to end poverty as the culmination of radical 18th century Enlightenment thought. In his book, An End to Poverty, Gareth Stedman Jones carefully articulates how the proposals to end poverty from the late 18th century Enlightenment thinkers like Thomas Paine and the Marquis de Condorcet, among others, differed substantially from previous formulations. Jones writes that what was new about their proposals was, quote, a realization that there need no longer be such a thing as the poor at all, a realization produced by the political and economic conditions of the last 2 decades of the 18th century. These new ideas, whether they were Paine's scheme for nationwide social insurance or Condorcet's universal education and emancipation proposals, were explicitly not framed as utopian dreams by their authors, but instead as serious-minded proposals for a new kind of society that could be realized here and now, nurtured in the crush of Enlightenment values and brought forth by revolutionary movements then active across Europe and the world. So in this book, we learn about Smith and Say and Malthus and the sort of reaction against some of this thinking, and about a moment of profound intellectual ferment that focused on that oh-so-modern question. How can poverty be ended? Can material scarcity be vanquished as a force in human affairs, or is poverty always with us, a kind of iron law of our existence? I mean, I think personally, Stedman Jones's revolutionary moment has a history which stretches back more than 200 years. Back to the fundamental historical rupture, in my view, that we sort of tend to lump together as the discovery of the New World. I'm sure it stretches back even farther, but I think that's a book for someone else, not for me. And we know that this discovery fueled utopian thinking right away, right? Most famously via Thomas More and Utopia in 1516. What scholarship has assumed thereafter is that the utopian framework constituted the primary manner in which an end to poverty was envisioned until the advent of Enlightenment thinking about social progress. Only then is this desire made practical, right? Outlined as it was by a set of proposals which Stedman Jones's book covers. And utopias have their own interesting and devoted literature, right? And I can't canvass it here. But I do think that J.C. Davis's famous 5 types of ideal society are very useful for our purposes. And as we'll recall, right, they are utopia itself, the millennium, the Arcadia, the land of Cockaigne, and the perfect moral commonwealth. And one subtype of in that 5-part schema is very interesting, the full employment utopia. And I think the general assumption that these 5 formulations sort of contain most of the thinking about societies without poverty, and indeed that this type of thinking was confined to the realm of speculation, I think that needs revising. I suspect there's a problem of scale here, as historians were in search of contemporary attempts to banish poverty entirely, completely, or unpick it from the social warp and weft. And we haven't paused to consider whether, taken together, all the actual efforts on the ground and across the British Atlantic to prevent poverty or to transmute the poor into something altogether different might not constitute exactly what we are seeking. I think another thing that we might be wary of, and this is certainly justifiable, is wary of inadvertently portraying colonial efforts to end poverty as a kind of imperial altruism. The idea that, it's already a range of scholars who attempt this. They claim for colonialism various kinds of altruistic motivation. And I should say quite clearly that I disagree profoundly with those and vehemently with those scholars. For one thing, I think the weight of evidence, regardless of the archives you select, regardless of how curated they are by the same hands that labored to expand the empire in the first place, those archives lend themselves strongly to the exact opposite interpretation, that for elites, ending poverty in the British Atlantic was a self-interested and colonially motivated pursuit. I remain, and my project remains, interested in the smaller scale, where we find all manner of proposals and initiatives and institutions which had as their aim the end of poverty for some, if not for all. Their authors or promoters then naturally proposed that, if their proposals were taken up nationally or globally, poverty could be ended for good. My talk today will consider some of these practical utopians, in this instance all men, but I should say that while this paper examines quite a public and kind of masculine historical or intellectual narrative, much of the work I want to do subsequently on education and sensibility and introspection, again very closely following Sarah Lloyd and Hilary Carey's more recent book, The Empires of Hell, or Empire of Hell. That work will focus more on women like Hannah More, Elizabeth Montagu, Margaret Cavendish Harley, and other members of the Blue Stocking Society, as well as on female authors across the 18th century, who all also intervened in debates about poverty's ends, poverty's utility, and all of whom shared a larger interest in public and social virtue. Many of the women in that circle, the Blue Stocking Circle, were also heavily involved in practical philanthropy, for instance, in the endowment of the Foundling Hospital. In and of itself, I think, a very strong example of practical attempts to end poverty, in this case for orphaned children. And so while I will spend most of my time today on proposals and schemes and the sort of intellectual content of poverty's place in colonialism, I want the end result of this project to be as focused on experience and on praxis as this initial focus on ideology will be here. And so I'll close with some brief comments on a good example of this, which would be the creation of the colony of Georgia in the 1730s. But before I do that, before I get into my practical utopians, I wanted to introduce the three themes of this project and sort of show how they sort of weave themselves through this project as a whole. And those three themes are in front of you: education, correction, and terraforming, which I'm proposing as a kind of organizing schema of poverty's historical utility, particularly in a kind of colonial context. And none of these three main themes are kind of confined to the realm of speculation. I think in each case, contemporaries envisioned an end of poverty taking shape, sort of within their, immediate material circumstances, within their lifetimes. And when I say terraforming, so education and correction are fairly traditional avenues of scholarship here. I think terraforming is different, and I think terraforming is new, and I should probably explain what I mean by that. I mean the radical alteration of physical spaces by humans to effect collective social ends. So there's a real question of scale around what constitutes terraforming here. I think the Down Survey, right, by Petty is, that's terraforming, or certainly could lead to terraforming. I think 17th century fen drainage projects are unambiguously terraforming, and Eric Ashe has written wonderfully and recently about this, right, in the draining of the fens. And these projects were justified as often as not as sort of projects that would end the assumed penury and idleness of the inhabitants of those spaces that were to be terraformed. So, for instance, this is from Ashe, and one pro drainage author around 1606. This is how they kind of justify the project. For the 1/2 and more of the year, they, the Fenlanders, live merely idle, and have no means to set them on work. The beggarly life that the poor idle wretches do lead, do manifest of what commodity it is to them. I don't think we necessarily should use the term terraforming to describe building pauper cottages on waste grounds, although I suppose we could. I think we should use it for things like fen drainage and for huge cadastral surveys and city plans, right? Like the sort of city plan for Washington in the late 18th century. I think that's utopian terraforming in a way that will help us conceptually to unpack what's going on in a very useful sense. But I do want to spend a moment sketching the other two themes as well before I kind of get to some practical examples of terraforming in a moment. And here, just for visual reference, are some of the sort of practical utopians that I want to talk about today. On the I suppose on the left of your screen would be Richard Hakluyt in a stained glass window. Yes, reading this left to right, right? Which was placed in a Bristol Cathedral in celebration of the colonization of Roanoke. Center top is a plate, 19th century reimagined plate of Pistorius, Daniel Pistorius, who I sort of think of as a practical utopian. I think he certainly has a utopian imagination. Below him, just for comedy and variety's sake, is Jeremy Bentham in both his painted and preserved varieties. And then on the far right is George Berkeley, who I will be talking about later on in this presentation as well, looking very smug in his lovely black and whites. Right. So let's move to my sort of first theme, education. Around 1676, the philanthropist Thomas Firmin wrote to his friend Robert Clayton, who was just about to become the mayor of London, suggesting a series of rules and regulations regarding the educational regime of pauper children in his workhouse school in Little Britain Street in the city. And Firmin's instructions are unsurprisingly much concerned with piety and work discipline and frugality, and less concerned with kind of in-class curriculum. He leaves that to the teachers. But he is keen to regulate leisure and writes that, quote, children are not to go into the fields till they have been at supper and prayers. By going into the fields first, they have supper and prayers, if any prayers at all, at very unreasonable hours. He also suggests that a bench should be erected in the yard so that the master, quote, will have sight of the gate and keep the girls from idling up and down as they too frequently do. With the pauper children so governed, Firmin hoped that additional benefactors would then subscribe to support the institution as a whole, and that he would sort of be able to grow the number of children kind of reformed and disciplined by this institution. Firmin also had instructions for adult visitors, or particularly for adults begging at the gate, and that's what you're looking at on this slide here. And with them, he was even less sympathetic. They could be admitted, he said, but, quote, were to lay only in the straw, and he would furnish the institution with a whipping post, stocks, fetters, handcuffs, and thumbscrews, etc., for such as shall be unruly. You can see that there on the slide. His charity school and workhouse were precocious examples in the 17th century of something that we find in the 18th century as a full-blown movement in print and politics, to incorporate as many workhouses and charity schools as possible sort of throughout the four kingdoms, particularly the three kingdoms, England, Wales, and Scotland. By 1725, Mary Jones has calculated there must have been about 1,400 of these in operation, particularly charity schools here, I think is what she's talking about. And the whole point of charity schools, and eventually trade schools too, like the ones that Jonas Hannaway is involved in, were to end the poverty of the children enrolled in them, largely to benefit what contemporaries described as the economic health and strength of the realm. In 1696, the Board of Trade actually invited Thomas Firmin to present evidence based on his extensive philanthropic experience. And their report, so they're concerned with the colonies, right? This is an interesting kind of overlap. And their report eventually included, they reported on the poor laws, and it included the line you can see on the other side of your screen on the left there, attributing in effect the relaxation of discipline, the corruption of manners, and the ill education of the poorer sort. That was what was increasing poverty in the realm. I think we have a robust history of early modern education, really wonderful history of early modern education. What I think we need is a bit of a reassessment of charitable education, trade schooling, and similar institutions, which comes to grips with how all these efforts fit into a larger pattern, not just of amelioration of the conditions of poverty, but of active efforts to end it too. I think we need to remind ourselves just how radical it still was to fund and construct a workhouse and a charity school in 1676. And I think we need to wrap our heads around the notion that pauper education was part of a larger package of correctional charitable efforts, designed one and all to root out idleness, that timeless bugbear of human productivity. Contemporaries saw idleness as the root of humanity's fallen condition, and early modern colonial acquisitions suggested utopian remedies to idleness. We're familiar, I hope, with some of the explorers who actually went in search of a physical Garden of Eden in the New World. My favorite being Walter Raleigh, who searched for it in Venezuela and Guyana. But there was more prosaic thinking also common here. In 1584, the Anglican minister and armchair geographer Richard Hakluyt envisioned New World plantations, by then established for contemporary Europeans as a sort of profoundly important development. He imagined these new plantations as spaces, quote, that would minister matter for all sorts and all states of men, in a manner that would keep all from idleness and deprivation. And as my abstract says for this paper, in 1618, the Virginia Company and the City of London got in on this when Sir Edwin Sandys tabled a formal petition before the London Common Council, asking that 100 poor and vagrant children who, quote, lie in the streets, having no place of abode nor friends to relieve them, be shipped to the fledgling colony of Jamestown at the city's expense. This was done that same year, and in 1620, the Privy Council wrote to Sandys, by now leading the Virginia Company himself, explicitly granting both the company and the City of London the right to send more poor and vagrant children to the plantations against their will, and noted primly, quote, the city deserves thanks and commendation for redeeming so many poor souls from misery and ruin. And if any children disobey or are obstinate, we authorize the imprisonment, punishment, and disposal of them, end quote. These actions to redeem so many poor souls from the effects of their poverty reflect a burgeoning imperial desire to transform unproductive subjects into a colonial resource in the interests of the state. And so they too are attempts to end poverty. They try to alleviate the conditions of poverty for some, to ostensibly create communities entirely without poverty elsewhere. Paternalism and the use of force were generally considered justified by the outcome. And this is true, you know, when we look at sort of later pamphlets. There's an anonymous, quote, affectionate lover of his prince and country, who argued in 1685, quote, that lusty common vagrants, who such as through idleness become useless and burdensome to the commonwealth, be either forced to labor in some honest way, or else, as a punishment for their idleness, be transported to our foreign plantations, to be there employed and made useful. Useful knowledge, right? We might describe these policies of correction as a kind of social alchemy akin to what Ted McCormick has found in William Petty's proposals to transmute the Irish into productive English subjects, in that case via the transplantation of English women. Sort of marry enough Irish men to enough English women, and sort of over time, generationally, they will transmute into a different kind of subject. Only here, in this transportation example, we see the dross of paupers, poor children, turned into the gold of productive colonial farm labor or breeding stock via a completely different crucible, right? Indentured servitude and transportation. And for me, all of these policies are welfare colonialism, a kind of imperial ideology which I think should be front and center in early modern history. Okay. So that's education and a little bit of correction as a kind of taste of some of the themes that I'm working with. Just so now another word on terraforming. Very briefly. This is personally the part of the story that I am most excited to explore, both domestically and overseas. I don't understand English colonialism as a purely outward-facing or center periphery type project. I see fen drainage increasingly as a very similar colonial pursuit, you know, in the Bedfordshire levels, as I do surveys of Ireland or new towns and city plans in the Americas. I sort of see these things as barely different at all in most respects. And one of my sort of fascinations at the moment, very much bolstered by Yamamoto's account of him as well, is with Andrew Yarrington. who's an engineer, an improver, and a kind of a restoration politics hot potato. Gets into a lot of trouble in the 1670s. Best known to us now as one of the earliest proponents of clover fields for agriculture, crop rotation, and for his work attempting to make rivers navigable across England. He also produced a well-known political economy pamphlet entitled England's Improvement by Land and Sea, 2 volumes. And this pamphlet advocated all sorts of agricultural, fiscal, and institutional improvements, including he was a huge fan of public granaries. I want to concentrate here, though, on Yarrington's speculative map making, because certain editions of England's Improvements, including an edition of the Folger, which I was lucky enough to see in person, contain these really rich, hand-drawn maps, which I think are really, really interesting. And so in a series of maps drawn in rare editions of England's Improvement, we find some really interesting renditions of communal living spaces, which you're looking at here. These are sort of artisan-dominated, almost like early modern apartment blocks, dotted across a new landscape, itself held together by drained and easily navigable rivers. This is presumably where Yarrington comes in, right? And containing sort of entirely new villages and towns devoted to the industrial production of textiles and finished goods. Yarrington's maps are, I think, part of a rich tradition of speculative map making, internal not just to European states, but external to them in sort of the larger European civil society too. A manifestation of how these composite polities attempted to, in effect, recolonize or terraform their own interiors, aiming at all manner of economic and social benefit. I think the obvious point I need to make here is that poverty it's rendered invisible by these maps in a very specific way, right? This speculative town planning imagines entire communities, almost Owenite, really early Robert, sort of Owenite kind of thinking here, where there is no poverty, where everybody is employed. There will be no need for the poor laws in this kind of speculative civic architecture. And I think that's very interesting. There's no space for beggars on this map. It presumes that no one will need to beg because everyone will be busy. And again, I think, Yarrington is the idea, the term practical utopian, I think fits this very snugly. Here is a man acutely interested in how land and space can be terraformed in order to sort of transform people. And these, I don't have time to go into some of the details in these maps, but I'm fascinated by them and by the sort of level of detail that we get. Okay. Moving on then to some of the practical utopians that I'd like to look at in the second half of my talk today. Richard Hakluyt being my first. And I won't dwell too long on Hakluyt because obviously we're going a long way back in time for, this is the real long 18th century here at the IHR. So many of you will know who Hakluyt is, right? Personal chaplain to Robert Cecil, son of William Cecil, chief signatory to the original petition to James I, asking to colonize Virginia, and of course the author of the Principal Navigations in 1589, which is a compendium of all the overseas exploratory and trading voyages undertaken by the English in the last thousand years or so. He was a lifelong proponent of overseas colonization, and he often wrote his pamphlets at the behest or in affectionate league with the principal sort of colonizing men of his age, so Philip Sidney, Humphrey Gilbert, Walter Raleigh. It is his apocryphal discourse concerning Western planting that I am most interested in today, because I think it sets up an entire model of welfare colonialism that I'm sort of concerned with. I think he sort of really sets up the structure of all that follows. It was laid before Queen Elizabeth at one point in the 1580s, and we can see the sort of immediate maritime and geopolitical considerations in many of its proposals. Of the 21 sections of the pamphlet, pretty much half concern sort of imperial maneuverings against the Spanish. But I'm interested in section 4, quote, that this enterprise will be for the manifold employment of numbers of idle men, and for breeding of many sufficient, and for utterance of the great quality of the commodities of our realm, sort of economic proposals. This section follows on quite closely from an extended discussion of all the wonderful resources available in the New World: gold and silver, spices and fibers, timber, fish, metals of all sorts. It is as if the unexploited land is sort of sitting silently there saying, plant me. And of course, we understand, there's been a lot of really wonderful history written about this attitude, about how Pagden writes brilliantly about this in The Burdens of Empire, how this attitude allows so much of colonialism to sort of surge ahead and, in such sort of unproblematic ways to the colonizers. And Hakluyt begins this section with an explicit ode to the power of colonizing to improve the welfare of existing British subjects. And he does this by way of reference to the effects of colonization on the Spanish and Portuguese empires. And this is what he says. It is well worth the observation to see and consider what the like voyages of discovery and planting in the East and West Indies hath wrought in the kingdoms of Portugal and Spain, both which realms, being of themselves poor and barren, and hardly able to sustain their inhabitants, by their discoveries found such occasion of employment, that these many years we have not heard of scarcely any pirate of these two nations. The reason is that by these their new discoveries, they have so many honest ways to set them on work, as they rather want men than means to employ them. But we, for all the statutes that hitherto can be devised, and the sharp execution of the same in punishing idle and lazy persons, for want of sufficient occasion of honest employment, cannot deliver our commonwealth from the multitudes of loiterers and idle vagabonds. You can see what Hakluyt is proposing here, with to do with these many thousands of idle people. He wants them picking cotton and planting sugarcane. He wants them down the salt mines. And from the research of people like Christopher Tomlins and Gwenda Morgan and Peter Rushton, we know that this indenture model of transatlantic transplantation forms an essential basis for this sort of important first wave of settler colonialism. But what's really fascinating about this proposal, to use the poor as empire's laborers, is this. It was meant to solve poverty at home as much as it was to make and settle an industrious New England abroad. Here's Hakluyt again, quote, "Such as by any kind of infirmity cannot pass the seas thither," he writes, "by this voyage shall be made profitable members regardless, by employing them in England in making of 1,000 trifling things, which will be very good merchandise for those countries where we shall have most ample vent thereof." So for Hakluyt, in all of his writings, you can see this really powerful thread throughout of transplanting the poor and transmuting the poor into imperial labor, that will be sort of brought across the ocean. And this is what England kind of goes on to attempt to do quite considerably. So that's Hakluyt. That sort of starts us off. Now let's jump ahead in time slightly to the English Revolution in 1649. And Peter Chamberlain, who's a member of the Hartlib Circle. There are three interesting Peter Chamberlains, but I'm interested in the youngest of that family, who was sort of physician and sort of utopian author and pamphlet writer. And he moved very successfully in that burgeoning network of radicals that we now describe as the Hartlib Circle. And he's written about in The Great Instauration in that light. Historiographically, we understand the Hartlib Circle, and we generally treat the Hartlib Circle as a kind of precursor to, or sort of an early stage of the British scientific enlightenment. And we connect it to the ferment of experimental knowledge making, which then took hold in England's coffee houses and parlors and salons from the 1660s onwards. But as we might expect by now, the entire circle around Hartlib appeared to see remedies for poverty and for the, quote, idleness of the realm's inhabitants as the foremost priority in their great quest to rebuild the four kingdoms after the conflicts, after the two civil wars. Chamberlain's published contribution to this debate was The Poor Man's Advocate in 1649, which came out aimed directly at MPs then sitting in the year 1649. It takes the form of a dialogue about the best aims of the state and the best means by which to radically change the circumstances of the poorest inhabitants of the realm. And The Advocate is a fascinating document in a whole host of ways. One of the most explicit is that he describes the poor as either the friends or the enemies of the new Republican state, depending on its policy line. And his proposal advocates effectively nationalizing all the former possessions of the monarchy, the episcopacy, their lands, goods, their chattels, and estates, rolling all of this together into an immense kind of tranche of resources and wealth, and then combining it with all the waste land, the fens, the commons, to create a huge joint stock reserved solely, he says, for the improvement and employment of the poor who are currently in receipt of parish relief. So the primary aim then of this national land reclamation and kind of public works project was the modeling of a kind of new type of Republican citizenry. And he lists some of the reasons to do this, and we find several that are of real interest here. He says, for the benefit of the whole nation, we should do this, right? By improving the lands that were never improved, by employing men that were not only useless, but a burden through idleness, and by converting them to good commonwealthsmen. Chamberlain explicitly ties the mass improvement of the poor to national and military strength as well. He suggests that in a short time, the practical effect of employing so many paupers will be, quote, an army always ready of honest men and men made so by employment and government, without further charge, and to the great terror of our enemies. In this manner, he thinks, the poor can contribute further still to this new model army projection of strength, a project which, again, I don't hesitate to remind you all, was colonial, right, as ventures in Jamaica and Ireland clearly show. The Advocates effectively also promotes a range of other radical solutions to poverty, including national projects of social housing, or what he calls, quote, collegiate habitation. And these new collegiate houses would be, in effect, the converted and empty palaces and country mansions of the monarch and his loyal nobles and gentlemen, and of the demolished episcopacy. So some of the imagined, he then, classic dialogue, right? He then imagines some principal objections that he should overcome, and these too are very revealing. One objection is that such a vast redistribution of resources to the poor would actually kind of allow them to be more idle than they already were, and would lead to the dissolution of chunks of the army, possibly to rebellion, and possibly to defeat in Ireland. And to this, Chamberlain has a very interestingly phrased, if quite commonly understood, rebuttal. He writes, "It is certain that employment and competencies do civilize all men, and make them tractable and obedient to superiors' commands, though otherwise ill-natured, none more intractable than idle beggars." But it is when he addresses the idea that the poor themselves may, by this national scheme, become too rich, that we see the true radicalism emerging from his proposals, the true end of poverty. He writes, and I think I have a slide of this. I do have a slide for this, and I may return to some of those in a moment. He writes, is there a necessity in nature, reason, or religion that they who are rich must be continued so, and they that are poor must always be so? Clearly, someone like Peter Chamberlain did not think so. Right. And yes, very briefly, I was quite lucky to see again some kind of rare editions of the Poor Man's Advocate, which doesn't survive in that many copies, I don't think. Again, in the Folger, they're held there with some annotation, which is interesting as well. All right. Two more thinkers I want to speak to kind of get us into the 18th century and sort of show how all of this is joined up. George Berkeley, right? Anglo-Irish Dean of Derry, famous immaterialist philosopher, producer of the Querist, and first man to endow a graduate scholarship in American colonial history. He was also a transatlantic utopianist, very interested in the transformative power of education. Now, Berkeley's welfare colonialism was produced in a very different register and to very different ends from some of my previous examples. But it still remains a form of visionary imperial transformation, which I think is no less important than the proposals we've encountered so far. In her Utopianism in 18th century Ireland, Deirdre Coanacan has described Berkeley as a brilliant example of, quote, the utopian propensity at work in the rich colonial and intellectual context of 18th century Ireland. Eric Gosted believes that Berkeley's entire vision of 18th century British society and the problems that beset it can be found distilled in a 1720 pamphlet of his entitled An Essay Towards Preventing the Ruin of Great Britain, which denounced the, quote, corrupt, degenerate age that we live in. As early as 1721 or 22, Berkeley's thoughts turned to how he personally could influence the national and imperial trajectory of this kind of fallen, overly luxurious, stock bubble obsessed society that he saw all around him. And in 1722, he wrote to his friend John Percival, Earl of Edgemont, about a scheme that he had concocted to plant a university and a utopian city on, quote, the Summer Isle, today Bermuda. And this is what he wrote in 1722 in May. Quote, it is now about 10 months since I have determined to spend the residue of my days in Bermuda, where I trust in Providence I may be the mean instrument of doing good to mankind. Clearly, unambiguously sort of utopian sentiment in that regard. So he wanted a college in Bermuda modeled on Trinity in Dublin to instruct both pastors of good morals and good learning, a thing, he says, God knows, much wanted, but also, so it's basically to sort of populate the churches of the colonial world. But alongside these men, these white Europeans, would be, quote, a number of young American savages who would be early imbued, with public-spirited principles, and they would become, quote, the fittest missionaries for spreading religion, morality, and civil life among their countrymen. So Berkeley's Berkeley's kind of utopian mission to end the kind of systemic poverty that he imagines among First Nations is to is via missionary work, is via religion. This would be accomplished by that great philanthropic engine of the 18th century, subscription charity. So this whole mission would be accomplished that way. And his first printed proposal for the Bermuda School came out subsequently in 1724, entitled A Proposal for the Better Supplying of Churches in Our Foreign Plantations and for Converting the Savage American to Christianity. Jonathan Swift described the scheme in a letter to Percival. Quote, he showed me a little tract which he designs to publish, and there your excellency will see his whole scheme of life, academic, philosophical, of a college founded for Indian scholars and missionaries. Berkeley then sought government patronage for this college. He sought a royal charter, and he sought considerable public buy-in. And amazingly, he got all of it. By 1725, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, the SPCK, was collecting subscriptions totaling more than £2,000. And actually, later on, just a few years earlier, Swift's jilted lover, Esther Van Homeren, known as Vanessa, colloquially, died and left her entire estate to George Berkeley, not to Swift, because he had left her, for the promotion of this scheme. And he had trustees on board by 1725, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Duke of Newcastle, the Lord Chancellor, and Robert Walpole. Quoting Coanacan again, quote, Berkeley indeed seems to have conceived of himself and his young friends as the leaders of a nation about to be reconstructed. This nation would have its philosopher and the author of the new principle, Berkeley, its economist in Thomas Prior, and its arbiter of taste and manners in Sir John Percival. So to make a long and very interesting story short, it turns out Bermuda is a really terrible place to construct a utopian university, particularly out of nothing. And frustrated by the growing reluctance of government to release any funds to him, and kind of newly wary of the Caribbean dimension of his venture, Berkeley instead resolves to set sail for Rhode Island in America, which he does in September 1728. He would then spend 33 months in Longport, Rhode Island, essentially waiting for the money to be released for his new college and conversing with a young Samuel Johnson, among other things. And Gosted writes that it was, quote, his philosophy of history that put Berkeley on that ship and on that course. And it comes to nothing, basically, is sort of like so many of these proposals, right? It never really gets off the ground. But how is this an interesting episode sort of connected to poverty and empire more directly, you might be asking? And the most obvious way that it is because of what happens next. So when he returns, somewhat chastened, from Rhode Island in 1731, the momentum has run out on Berkeley's scheme. The promised funds are not coming. They never materialized. But he is quickly appraised of a much larger and much more far advanced project, then in formulation, which was proceeding along similar lines to him. And that was the funding, settling, and effective legal creation of an entire colony reserved for the poor, particularly for poor debtors, which was to be called Georgia. And I should say I am recording this lecture today on the day when I suspect Georgia will be called for Joe Biden, or very close to it, November 6th. The man who appraises Berkeley of this, James Oglethorpe, a soldier, prison reformer, and philanthropist, wrote to Berkeley in 1731 asking him to get involved. And he wrote, "Charity and humanity is the motive that hath united them, the Georgia trustees, and their end is the relieving of want for their fellow creatures, both in mind and body. Therefore, from their very institution they are obliged to be assistant to your designs, since your motives and ends are the same. The scheme," he says, "is to procure a quantity of acres, either from government or by gift or purchase, in the West Indies, and to plant thereon 100 miserable wretches, who, being let out of jail by the last year's act, are now starving about the town for want of employment." Berkeley eventually declined to donate any of his considerable resources to this colony, pleading some prior commitment to Yale University with respect to some of his personal funds. But one irony of this story is that the original parliamentary grant that George Berkeley won for his Bermuda University scheme in 1725, and which never materialized, actually does get used to fund an end of poverty in Georgia instead: the mass release of poor prisoners and their subsidized resettlement into putatively utopian conditions across the ocean. And George Berkeley wasn't done with these questions just yet. He becomes, in the 1730s and 1740s, an astute commentator on society, empire, and public benefit, particularly in a publication he serialized called the Poorest. Between 1735 and 37, Berkeley produced more than just a little bit over 1,000 questions, which he described as several queries proposed to the consideration of the public. And they were all on the subject of public benefit, improvement, and sort of national and imperial interest. And I want to reflect briefly on the first 4 queries from the Querist. Out of 1,000 questions that he asks, here, with these 4 questions, is where he starts. Number 1, whether there ever was, is, or will be an industrious nation poor or an idle rich. Number 2, whether a people can be called poor where the common sort are well fed, clothed, and lodged. So sort of interrogating, the basic floor. If you raise the floor far enough underneath those who are impoverished, are they no longer impoverished? Number 3, whether the drift and aim of every wise state should not be to encourage industry in its members, and whether those who employ neither heads nor hands for the common benefit deserve not to be expelled like drones out of a well-governed state. And number 4, whether the 4 elements and man's labor therein be not the true source of wealth. So I think there's more to do with George Berkeley, and I think the Querist is potentially a very promising avenue of inquiry into sort of the after echoes of his utopian ventures. Okay. Last practical utopian, although I don't know, maybe practical isn't an adjective that we should assign to Jeremy Bentham. I'm not sure. But I wanted to end with Bentham before I conclude, because he is the arch utilitarian, and I am interested in a long kind of history of the utility of poverty. And so I think it would be remiss not to show how what Bentham is proposing with his national charity scheme in 1795 fits into this larger tradition almost seamlessly in many respects. It's not a departure, the way, at least I don't think it's a departure, the way Stedman Jones seems to suggest. I don't think I have enough yet about Bentham to sort of attempt a fuller interrogation of his intellectual project, but I do want to signpost, his thinking on poverty in particular here. So at the end of the 18th century, debates over the utility of poverty came to a head in the work of people like Bentham and like Thomas Malthus. And Bentham characteristically set aside almost 2 years in the run-up to 1795 to devote himself to an immense project to reform the poor laws. Most of this project, which amounts to about 2,400 manuscript pages, was never published. But we do have access to it now digitally because of the UCL project, which I'm very excited about, and I'm keen to get in there. His poor law reform, which he called national charity, featured a joint stock in many respects very similar to Peter Chamberlain's proposals. And it was, however, in the words of Charles Baumüller, quote, replete with a repressiveness so pervasive, so soul-destroying, and with so little regard for either the civil liberties or the emotional sensitivities of those whose health, moral as well as physical, and whose happiness it set out to promote and protect, that its administrative progressiveness pales in comparison. What Bentham was proposing was the involuntary imprisonment of all those seeking relief, and many of those poor not seeking it, under the auspices of a national public company administered for the benefit of the taxpayer. Where his proposals differed from many of the ones we've talked about today, and that I've talked about today, is that he was unwilling to use penal transportation, and very skeptical of penal transportation, as Hilary Carey makes clear, to offload the poor into other climes and colonies. And he thought instead they should be herded into closely regulated panopticon-like institutions where they would be weaned from their idle habits. And some of you may be familiar with Pentonville Prison and the kind of the origin story, the guiding ideology behind that first massive panopticon prison. Benthamite political philosophy is often portrayed, I think, as a radical departure from previous positions, but what I hope I've shown is that his views on ending poverty are actually pretty conventional. It's only his fervor and perhaps the volume of production that he dedicates to the idea that are distinct. I think he argued in effect for exactly the same kind of internal colonization that I started this paper with. And with, he's in favor of the replacement of unproductive land and idle people with a new industrious class of closely supervised laborers. Bentham's, quote, depth of passion on the subject, his frenetic, even fanatical search to abolish idleness in all its forms, can hardly be exaggerated. For Bentham, idleness led only to evil. And that's Baumüller again writing about Bentham. Accordingly, Bentham imagined into existence communities without idleness and therefore without poverty too. And of course, his proposals went to logical extremes to accomplish this. So he filled every day of his kind of, of his putative poor people with some form of productive work. He scheduled their time really militantly. And this kind of overscheduling of their lives is something that other thinkers in the period pick up and actually consider absurd and harmful to the poor overall. Bentham was also appalled by administrative difference, right? And he uses, that sort of language when he's complaining about the melange of local practices all across England with respect to poor relief. This is Bentham writing, quote, in a cluster of small pauper establishments straggling over England, dispersed and unconnected, all is opacity and obscurity. Okay, so he doesn't like how illegible and how difficult it is to see into the sort of myriad poor relief systems and practices of the realm. And so I think the manuscript pages of Bentham's national charity scheme are one of the next immediate archival frontiers for my project. I think this is an apex example of welfare colonialism being, quote, brought home, right, again, in its most totalizing and dangerous form. A form where every movement and every moment that a pauper had was to be apportioned, regulated, supervised, and made productive for the benefit of the state. Okay. So to conclude then, I hope today that I've outlined some evidence of how education, correction, and terraforming form the central planks of early modern efforts to end poverty, to improve it out of existence. And I hope I've provided some decent examples of how this desire, this utopian propensity to end poverty, could animate the landscape of both imperial justification, the why of empire, and indeed the how of it, the means by which empire extended and expanded. And I think, there's many other ways to do this, and there's many other ways I hope to do this. This has been very kind of intellectual and sort of based on, looking at the ideology of empire. I am keen to ensure that practice and praxis and experience stay central to this story. I think there's going to be some difficult history writing, marrying up all of these words with what the lived experience was of settler colonists on the ground, particularly poor settler colonists. But that's the work I'm sort of doing now. And I know I have a great deal to do, not the least of which is to trawl my way all the way through Colonial Office number 5, which is just a treasure trove on this subject, and through the State Papers Colonial and British History online, because again, absolute treasure trove. But I do think it's a project worth doing. And so it remains just to sort of briefly wrap this all together as best I can. I like thinking with the work of James C. Scott, particularly Seeing Like a State, which you can see on the slide there. In that book, Scott notes that he originally wanted to do a different project. He wanted to investigate why the state, in his view, always seemed to be the enemy of people who move around. The Roma, the Bedouin tribes, indigenous populations, migrant labor, vagrants, runaway slaves, the poor generally, right? The state seems to reserve particular opprobrium for those groups. Now, Scott didn't take that road, not directly. He instead started looking at large-scale sort of schematic failures like the Great Leap Forward or Russian collectivization, South American agricultural modernization. But what he showed was how states are interested in controlling and transmuting mobile and precarious populations. And that interest, how it produced immense disasters of human suffering as a result. And in this project, what I hope to chart is how contemporaries between 1600 and 1800 tried to transform ideas about ending poverty into praxis, to entirely mixed results. And I want to show how social dreaming and overseas expansion combined to produce welfare colonialism in the Atlantic world. I want to do this in order to demonstrate how profoundly this idea of colonization in all its forms was seen as an end to poverty, a national renewal, always already at the expense of a silenced, marginalized, and often indigenized other, and how this idea still remains central to our historical and frankly to our present day understandings of the purposes of settler colonialism and empire. And why we need to see all this well-meaning colonialism for what it truly is, the very best excuse for bad behavior in history. Ends justifying means. Thank you.